Let's turn our Bibles to Genesis 37. Today we start a mini-series on Joseph, one of really the true stellar characters in the Bible. Very few people come out clean in the Bible besides God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus. Joseph is close to that. He really is a top-flight human being. We have 13 chapters of narrative on Joseph from Genesis, and certainly we can only hit the highlights in these 3 lessons that we'll have today and in the coming weeks. It will be a 3-part series on integrity, forgiveness, and today we will focus on suffering. Now, it's easy to fear the Old Testament and not read it too much. Here's the danger of that. You will miss out on Jesus. Because Jesus is in every book of the Old Testament. The whole thing is about Him. He's the overarching hero of God's story. So if you don't read your Old Testament, you will miss out on Jesus. So as we read about Joseph, Joseph is a type of Jesus. Joseph is a foreshadowing of Jesus. Look for that, even in the details, as we study Joseph. And keep this in mind, again, the true hero of the story, of the narrative of Joseph, is Jesus. So let's begin reading here in verse 1, Genesis 37. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, his son, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. All right, this is not beginning well. If you know anything about siblings, not good. And we already see that Jacob has multiple wives. And Joseph is a snitch. So that's where we start here in verses 1 and 2. Verse 3. Now Israel, and that's Jacob's God-given nickname, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. All right, that's not good either. That's favoritism. Favoritism alert here. So Joseph was loved more than any of the other sons of Jacob, because he had been born to Jacob in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. Verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. Let's stop right there. We see here the curse of sin. Ladies and gents, I present to you the first royal family of the nation of Israelites. This is God's people. The 12 tribes of Israel are the 12 sons of Jacob. And many of us come from dysfunctional families. But look at these guys. Right? You have Joseph's father, Jacob. It doesn't mention all the wives. He has 4 wives. Now, this is not illegal at the time. It's just not highly advised by anyone on this planet. It always sounds like a good idea for a man. You're like, yeah, let's get a bunch of wives. It is a disaster waiting to happen. So you have 12 boys, plus girls as well. Lots of sin in this family. Jacob's oldest son, Reuben, slept with one of his dad's wives, his own mother-in-law. You have Jacob making poor choices with women. He has a chronic problem with favoritism that he learned from his mom. Jacob has a favorite wife, that's Rachel, and he has a favorite son, Joseph. Now, Jacob, and this is the story all of us probably know, to show his favoritism for Joseph, Jacob gives his son the infamous Technicolor Dreamcoat. Right? And this would have really symbolized not just the ornaments on it and the colors, but the word here would have indicated to him the type of coat it was. It was long-sleeved. That's significant because a man who wore a long sleeve coat was not a man who was going to do any labor. So you see where I'm going here. So Joseph's job was to wear the coat, not do the labor, but to check on the brothers to see if they were up to no good and if they were doing their labor. So this is a family cursed by sin, and we can't even get into all of it. But so much of it is right here. Gossip, violence, murder, revenge, war. We mentioned favoritism, jealousy, hypocrisy, hatred, prideful competition, arrogance, lies, deceit. People having sex with people in their own family, prostitution, rape, immorality, and the list goes on and on. How's your family doing? Like this is messed up. And this is the family God used to build His nation. And as many of us know firsthand, sin in a family leads to suffering in a family. Let's keep reading in verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Verse 9. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me."
I can't help you with that at the moment.
Verse 10. When he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father, he kept the matter in mind. So here have Joseph. He has these incredible dreams, dreams that would mostly come true. But come on, man. Why say this crazy stuff out loud? We don't know. We don't have the whole story. But he says it to his brothers who already hate him. So maybe he's a naive teenager. Maybe he's arrogant. Maybe God commanded him to say these things because it was prophecy. We simply don't know. Awkward, though. Very awkward. Doesn't really provide much unity for the family that was in need of it. So all we know is this first family of Israelites is a house of dynamite. And it's ready to explode. Let's read what happens next in verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Snitch. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "Well, what are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "Well, they've moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go on to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Verse 18. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. This is like the prodigal son parable in reverse. They saw him from a distance, but they wanted to kill him when he reached them. Verse 19. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Let's just throw him into the cistern here in the desert. Don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and they threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Now this next part is cold-hearted. Verse 25. As they sat down to eat their meal. So their brother, their brother is in a cistern. And they're plotting to kill him. But let's just have a meal together while he's suffering. So as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, well, what do we gain? What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. Thank you, Judah. All right, verse 28. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So when Reuben returned to the cistern, he saw that Joseph was not there. He tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and he said, the boy isn't here. Where can I turn now? Then they got the robe. They got Joseph's robe. They slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe. He recognized it and he said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph surely has been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put a sackcloth, and mourned his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, in mourning will I go down to the grave to my son. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So there you have it, the 12 tribes of Israel. A family that explodes, implodes because of sin. In cold blood, Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. And that was the better option instead of killing him. That was the merciful thing to do. They sell him into slavery instead of killing him in cold blood. And you can read later in Genesis 42:21. It gives us more color to this story. Genesis 42:21. It tells us that Joseph, in great distress, while he's in that cistern, he's begging his brothers to have mercy on him. He's not silent going through this. He's just crying out, save me. Don't kill me. I'm your brother. But they would not listen. Because Joseph is dead to them. So Joseph is separated from his father. He's 17 years old. He's separated from his father. He's left for dead by his own people, his own family. And Joseph suffered a lot. And we're going to look at that in a few moments. But I want to not pass up on the dad and the family and the brothers. Not only did Joseph suffer for this sin, and did Joseph suffer because of sin, the father Jacob suffers for his sin of favoritism. He suffers for the sins of his sons. He suffers for the sin of his family, and he cannot be comforted, not by anyone. Sin hurts everyone in its path.
Yeah, that's right.
Joseph's brothers, if you read the rest of this narrative, and we'll get there in the coming weeks, Joseph's brothers, they suffer all their lives after doing this.
Yep.
It made life miserable for them. They suffered all their lives for what they did to Joseph. They didn't get away with it. It didn't solve their problem of hatred and jealousy. It made their lives worse. The demons of hatred caused them to suffer the duration of their lives. Even after reconciliation, many, many years later with Joseph, they were still living in fear of what they did and being punished for it. That's sin.
Yep.
Now back to Joseph. Many of us know what happens next to Joseph. 17 years old, he spends the next 13 years of his life as a slave and a prisoner in a foreign country. The prime of his life. 17 years old until he's 30 years old. That part of his life snatched away from him. No choices, no control. It's just taken away, and he was forced to live with it and make the best of it. He's falsely accused of rape. He's punished for crimes he did not commit. He saves the life of a fellow prisoner, and then that man completely forgets who saved him. He lives in isolation. He lives in despair. He has the curse of feeling lonely because most of his family hates him and they think he's dead. For 22 years, more than 2 decades, 22 years, there's not a single apology. No apology offered to Joseph from those who hurt him. No apology from those in his family who forgot him. No apology from the people that nearly destroyed him because of their sin. The dreams of Joseph seemingly crash and burn. Now that's the suffering that sin will leave in its wake. 13 years a slave as a prisoner. 22 years without anyone saying to Joseph, I'm sorry, I sinned against you. That was wrong. That's a lonely place to be. That's a lot to carry. That's rock bottom. That's a long time to wait. But that's the vulnerability of hope. That's living in weakness. And that's terrible suffering. To build a bridge to us, because of sin, all of us are either coming out of a period of suffering in our lives, we're in the middle of a period of suffering in our lives, or I'm sorry, but we're about to go into a period of suffering in our lives. But here's the good news. Remember, Joseph foreshadows Jesus. If you can relate at all to the suffering of Joseph, certainly Jesus also meets you in your suffering. Let's look at Isaiah 53, an incredible prophecy that's dead on about Jesus, the Messiah to come. Isaiah 53 verse 2. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men. A man of sorrows, a man familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. And this is exactly why we all need Jesus. Jesus is familiar with suffering. Jesus is a man of sorrows. Man of sorrows, what a name for the Son of God who came. Familiar with suffering, a man of sorrows. Jesus, He is with us. He knows all about suffering. Jesus came down to this earth. He made Himself weak for you and me. He meets us in our weakness. He's been there. He's done that. Jesus made Himself weak. He's not a victim. He's a victor. He gave Himself over to weakness because He loves us. He did this. He took it all the way to the cross to prove it to us. Jesus suffers with us. He meets us in our suffering. Jesus is the only one who completely empathizes with you Jesus is the only one that can completely redeem you in your suffering. In fact, God specializes in this.
Yeah.
God specializes into turning suffering on its head. Only God can turn the tables on the curse of sin and turn it into a blessing in your life through Jesus. This is what God does.
Amen.
God is the potter, we're the clay, and certainly when you're the clay and you're getting poked and pushed and molded and shaped and formed on that potter's wheel, it is a period of suffering and it hurts, but you can trust the hand of God in your suffering.
Yeah.
No matter your past,
Amen.
no matter your present, no matter your current suffering, God will take an ugly, discarded, cursed lump of clay, just like us, and mold it into something glorious. With Jesus, you're not a victim of your suffering. With Jesus, you're a victor in your suffering. Choose Jesus. So what's troubling your mind today? I'm just going to have that pregnant pause for a moment. Think about it. What was bothering you when you got up this morning? What was really hurting you this week? What was distracting you this week? What was it that caused you to suffer? And of course, it could have been self-inflicted, all right? But what's troubling you? What's bothering you? What's your current suffering right now? And I challenge you, this week, right here, right now, make a connection between your current suffering and the work of God. What is God doing? You may say, well, I'm suffering, but the better question is, what is God doing in this suffering?
Amen.
You're not always going to get that specific answer. This is a trusting, loving, obedient relationship with God. He has the track record. You can trust Him. He's given us everything. He's given us Jesus. He allowed Jesus to suffer, but then He raised Him up on the third day. He delivered Him and rose Him from the dead.
Amen.
This is what God does.
Amen.
God takes beauty out of the ashes of your life through Jesus. I challenge you, make the connection between your suffering and the work of God.
Amen.
And if you allow Him, God will use your suffering to redeem you. God will use your current suffering to strengthen you, to love you in ways you never imagined possible. So how do we do this? I think it takes the mindset of the Apostle Paul. When he said in Philippians 3 verse 10, I want to know Christ. And I ask you today, as you make this connection, if you want to make the most out of your suffering, if you want to gain from it, to become more like Jesus, it's the mindset of Paul. I want to know Christ. Do you want to know Christ? He says, I want to know Christ and the power of His resurrection.
Amen.
Who here wants to experience the power of Christ's resurrection?
Amen.
Who wants to know Christ? That all sounds, we sound amen. I say amen to that. But Paul next says, let's start from the beginning. I want to know Christ and the power of His resurrection and to share in the fellowship of His sufferings. Becoming like Him in His death. And so somehow to attain to the resurrection of the dead. So yeah, I want to know Christ. I want to know the power of His resurrection. I want the success story. I want to be a victor in Jesus. I want to experience that. But the package contains if you want to fellowship with Jesus, if you want to be with Jesus, part of that is the fellowship of sharing in His sufferings. There's no way around it. And you know why? In order for there to be a phoenix that rises from the ashes, it has to get to ashes first.
Yeah, right.
You can't have a resurrection without a death.
Come on, Marcus.
So that's what Paul's talking about here. That's what he's talking about when he says, man, I die every day. Because Christ died, therefore all died. I am compelled by the love of Christ, 2 Corinthians 5. So Paul says here in Philippians 3, I want to know Christ and the power of His resurrection. And I want to share in the fellowship of His sufferings. Why? Because I can become like Him in His death. And then somehow, some supernatural way, as I become like Him in His death, I will rise too. There's a resurrection for me. So, this is one of the hardest things. This is so upside down, to embrace suffering. But we have Jesus to look to. He did it. He did it. And Paul would say again, outwardly we're wasting away. But inwardly we're being renewed day by day. So this week, make the connection, whatever it is, if it's been long-term suffering, unexpected suffering, mental health, physical health, family, disappointments, your job, relationships, whatever it is, see the connection between your suffering and the amazing, gentle, extraordinary, surprising hand of God at work in your life.
Amen.
So Joseph and his family serve as a reminder that from the very beginning, God's people are lost without Jesus. And as we'll study in the coming weeks, it's the Jesus we see in Joseph that actually paves the way for God to resurrect Joseph's life into something completely unexpected and beautiful through the flames of suffering. So next week we will explore the Christ-like integrity of Joseph in the midst of suffering.